Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and in this episode of Call Like I See It, we're going to discuss the 50th anniversary of hip-hop, both generally and in the context of a recent documentary that's airing on Hulu right now that featured artists and contributors to the culture. And, you know, with people from Lola Brooke to E40, you know, to the Locks to MC Light, you know, so all, you know, generations and, you know, just all types of people. So it was a pretty interesting documentary. And later on, we're going to react to the effort, you know, and another hip hop related, you know, we're going to react to an effort that, you know, prosecutors are using the lyrics of Young Thug, one a rapper, to as far as prosecuting his case. And, you know, Fat Joe had a pretty interesting reaction to that, and just kind of we'll react to that. Joining me today is a man who knows how to make people feel something. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to make him say, Yeah.
That's about as much as you'll get out of me.
I said, you're supposed to make him say that.
Yeah, oh, okay.
You ain't supposed to say it.
Let's have a show.
Now, we're recording this on December 19th, 2023. And this year, we've seen much written and recorded about hip-hop's 50th anniversary. You know, the creation, so to speak, from 50 years ago being spoken of was back in 1973. And people point to a back-to-school jam, which was held on August 11th, 1973. And it was by DJ Kool Herc. And, you know, this is in the Bronx, New York. And this back to school jam had at minimum, you know, DJ Kool Herc, you know, spinning records, and you had, you know, people, you know, dancing, B-boys, B-girls, you know, so to speak, or their forebears, you know, all in ways that we may find familiar. But along these lines, just, you know, for full context, you know, the culture of hip hop is actually considered to have four elements, in addition to, you know, MCing or rapping, which we're all accustomed to, and DJing as well. There's also breaking, you know, B-boys, B-girls, breakdancing, and graffiti. So, you know, like that's at its pure sense. But you know, much of the attention though, you know, goes to the DJing and the MCing. You know, those are the most prominent things from a commercial standpoint. So, you know, I want to just kind of get us started. We'll get to the documentary in a second, but I wanted to get your big picture kind of thoughts. You know, just what kind of stands out to you, Tunde, as we're looking at 50 years of hip hop.
I'll say it with a smile that I must be getting older. So, and I say that with a smile and as a joke because, you know, being 45 years old, hip hop has been part of my whole life. So I joke and say, oh, it's 50. That means I'm getting older. So no, and I guess as I think about it, yeah, it's interesting. You and I actually literally don't know what the world looks like without hip hop. So yeah. I think one of the biggest things that stands out, which I know will be part of our discussion today, is really the global influence that hip hop has had and that we have watched from a young age kind of blossom and mushroom out from exactly like you said, from certain parts of American culture, primarily those that were seen as maybe forgotten and overlooked, you know, inner cities and starting, like you said, in the Bronx in New York at a time in the 1970s when the Bronx had been neglected. And if people go look at videos of the Bronx in the 1970s, there was a lot of, you know, it looked like a war zone. The buildings were on fire. There was a lot of dilapidation, and the housing projects were starting to fall apart after having been built, you know, maybe a generation prior. And there was a lot of that kind of, what do we do with these parts of town, especially coming out of the 1960s and a lot of the tensions that the country had over civil rights. So I think that to me is what is interesting about hip hop 50 years later, is that not only its cultural impact on the world, which we'll discuss, but also the fact that it's matured, kind of like you and I over that period of time. So hip hop's a little grayer than maybe it was back when we were kids.
Yeah. So that's well, I mean, it wasn't gray at all, you know, then, you know, so, and that's it now, you know, there's a mix of some gray and there's a mix of some youth, you know, so, and obviously it's still an art form that's primarily seems to be driven by the youth, but yeah, it's much more diverse, you know, from a maturity standpoint. To me, I would say actually what has stood out to the most to me is how much it's evolved, you know, but part of that is we're seeing an art form start from scratch. Like if you compare it to another art, if you compare it to, like painting or something like that, or other, even, if you're talking about postmodern, like any particular form of an art, like just we haven't seen a lot of other art forms change that much over the last 50 years, versus where it was to where it is, and then all the things in between. And so, I mean, that is being able to see something start from scratch and then become something so big is remarkable in itself. And, I think that one of the things that really, when you think about it, stands out about that is how technology plays a role in this. If hip hop started now, for example, where information is communicated over large distances so easily, you probably wouldn't have distinct styles evolve the way that you did, where you had, if you go back in the 80s and the 90s, you had, East Coast hip hop had a sound, West Coast hip hop had a sound, South comes in with its own sound, and then there's within the South, there's the Houston sound, there's the Memphis sound, there's the Atlanta sound, different things like that. And so, and then on the West Coast, there's the Bay Area, there's LA. These are all distinct sounds, and then of course in New York, you could, the discerning eye, could hear differences between Brooklyn and the Bronx. So to me, that it happened when it did allowed for it to kind of evolve separately for a while. I'm kind of in a true evolution sense, like animals that are on different continents that are separated can evolve away from each other a little bit and create their own distinctions. And then, when it came back together, so to speak, on a more national scale, it wasn't it wasn't all the same thing. There were a lot of different unique styles. And then what that allowed for is for things to get blended, and things to even allowed for even more creativity. So, it's fortuitous in the sense, technology allowed for the creation of the art, in terms of, the records being available, on a large scale and so forth. But they gave it enough space to kind of incubate in various places and be developed in different ways in various places, which I think creates a more full art form today.
Yeah, it's an interesting bringing in some Darwinism into the Galapagos Islands.
It's like you got platypus, on one side.
I know it's That's why I get nerdy with it. It's the finches on the Galapagos Islands versus the mainland.
Exactly.
But so can we have a debate of was hip hop created by intelligent design?
Yeah, intelligent design.
So, hold on. Yeah, let's not go on a tangent. No, but it's a great point because look, there's a lot of interesting things to pull out of that, right? I mean, number one, this is one of we hear so many people complain about our country in general, right? Americans that are so down on our own nation. But one of the beautiful things about our nation is our huge geographic and cultural diversity within the country. So you speak well to that hip hop is an art form. And especially the fact that there was enough technology to create the music, which I know we'll get into in terms of the electronics and where microchips and processing was going and how it affected music. And as well as things like radio and 8-track tapes and cassettes and records. But there wasn't so much like now where this stuff got out and could be, it's kind of almost like the sapiens unification theory, that everybody would have figured this out together en masse and the sounds wouldn't have been as distinct. Because to your point, just doing the reading, we saw DJ Kool Herc, who's credited with being the initial guy who started hip hop at the party in the Bronx in August of 1973, so on and so forth. But
as far as creation myths go, that is, I say myth, not to say that it's not true, but just
I want to get on that
what it is.
Later,
but that's a really cool one, I would think.
Yeah. And I think we should definitely revisit that. But for the sake of just my comments here, it wasn't until 1979 that you had the first rap album or hip hop album played on the radio, and actually like a chart and actually an album produced. So for 6 years, this art form was allowed to just incubate in that culture in the Bronx. And then I'm sure it probably spread a little bit, maybe in the Northeast and all that, and down to maybe Washington, D.C. And like you're saying, these cultures became distinct. And in preparing for today, it reminded me when I read about that a lot, which is also part of American cultural history, the blues. And it reminded me of country music. Because in the different but similar way, though that type of music was also started by a certain class of people that generally were seen as the lower class of society, in certain geographical and cultural pockets of the country. But when it spread to other parts of the country, you also had those changes. So like country, like you're saying, in Memphis is different maybe than country or blues in Mississippi, even though they're of the same genre. So it's a very interesting observation in terms of how our culture impacted the genre.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's going to be more difficult now. I mean, it's not impossible because you still got people, on the grind, and they're performing in clubs and, developing sounds in different areas. But because everything goes to whether it be TikTok, SoundCloud or whatever, there is more national sounds, so to speak, or sounds that, like the things that will be less individual, and that's kind of the biggest thing I said about that technology. And just, just to tie it up, the Rapper's Delight, with Sugar Hill Gang, 1979, being the first song that you referenced that charts, gets on the charts and really introduces the world to more, to hip hop, so to speak. So yeah, that's a nice incubation period. And then even from there, like you start ramping up in the 80s and, becoming a commercial behemoth really doesn't happen until the 90s, and so but it's seeing the evolution though, is just one. And this is one where we talk about living memory sometimes. Like we're in the, this kind of Generation X is kind of the generation that it really took hip hop and pushed it, into society like that. And then now we've seen it's multi-generational in the way that now we've seen multiple generations take a crack at it and, all pushing it to different areas or pushing it to different extents. So, another thing, like we watched, a documentary. We wanted to kind of see what the culture was saying about the 50th anniversary. So there's a documentary where we'll put in the show notes. We got it from Hulu. And so it's hip hop at 50, rhythms, rhymes, and reflections. And this is, it was, I think, spearheaded by Angie Martinez. But, it had many, many, many contributors. And I mean, I thought it did a good job of bringing in different perspectives. And they talked about 4 different planks in it, social justice, women empowerment, financial literacy, and mental health, in terms of how those things were present and or had evolved in hip hop. And then also just had a larger conversation about hip hop within the context of that. So which one of these or a couple of these, discussions that were had, these roundtables that they had with, again, prominent artists or executives or social, social organizers, whatever, which of these themes caught your attention the most?
I think all, the 4 topics in terms of social justice, women empowerment, financial literacy, and mental health, I thought they were kind of on par with each other. So I can't say one stood out. The only one that I came into thinking about before the documentary was just the financial part, kind of, we all know that, like you said, hip hop started at 0. And now we have literally people that have become billionaires from the hip hop industry and being successful. So I had thought about that. I never really thought to focus on the inclusion of women early in hip hop and the contrast that has and the positive kind of influence of female artists in contrast with some of what we all kind of see as misogyny and the way that some men talk and treat women in the culture as well. So I found that an interesting contrast, something great that they highlighted.
Which, by the way, isn't something that's limited to hip hop. That's something that you can point to the larger American culture, and in terms of how, like, many would say, oh, hip hop is very misogynistic, and it has been over times. But in many respects, hip hop has kind of mirrored the misogyny of the larger American culture.
Yeah, and I think that
you have this lane of women empowerment specifically, and where women now are essentially as prominent as men in terms of the actual faces of hip hop. That's something that where you're showing progress there that's on par or advanced beyond that of the American society at large.
Yeah, and so that's a great point. It just reflects American society. And that's another thing that really, to me, hip hop culture, like the whole evolution of hip hop is so American, if I can say it that way. It's a great reflection of not only American culture, but I think who we as Americans believe we are in terms of the entrepreneurial spirit. And like
for
you said,
each of those 4 items that we missed, that were hit on in the documentary, you could say, hip hop, it reflects and it kind of pushes American culture.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. The whole part about the women is a great reflection of that. And so, but just to finish off, is the social justice. I mean, I understand it, but I see it more clear now, which we'll discuss. And then the mental health part, I was also I was thought of a term here. I was smitten by it, if I can say that, because I was like, wow, that's actually, I never thought of that. But the discussion of mental health today was happening in hip hop without hip hop realizing it back in the 80s, all the way through now. So I just thought those four all had a very interesting, just part of the discussion. I don't know if there was one that I could say.
Well, I mean, I think to me, I would say there were all of them. Yeah, were worthwhile and everything like that. You were just talking about the mental health. The thing that was interesting to me about the mental health piece, and you said how this has been kind of interwoven in, but it was never the thing that people made it. Like, it wasn't made out to be about this, but it was just in the art form, constantly, whether it be going back to songs like Mind Playing Tricks on You, anything like that. Like, just, it's always been around it. It's just that it's an art, and art forms are oftentimes forms of expression of emotion and expression of bearing soul and so forth. So like that. So it's not a surprise that an art form would embrace or bring forth mental health thoughts, conversations before society at large was comfortable with it, because art is supposed to do that to us. It's supposed to get us talking about or thinking about things before we might do it on our own, our kind of more linear minds, so to speak. The art minds are supposed to take us there. So I thought, just the acknowledgement that it did it was cool, but I would say like that almost would be to expected. I want to comment though on the social justice aspect of it, because so much of hip hop has been, it was almost like it for a time, like the social justice aspect was almost the heartbeat of it, in the sense that before social media, there was, and the documentary got into this, like the window into what was happening outside of your own community. If things weren't being covered on the network news, that could be hip hop. In terms of, like how people were being treated, whether it be some of the same themes we think about today, as far as, issues with police, things with policing and communities and so forth. These things were being talked about in hip hop, but they weren't necessarily being covered in the news in the same way. And there was no TikTok, Facebook, anything like that, where people were publishing and saying, hey, look at this, look what just happened here, or something like that. So it was a window into what America in general found to be a very uncomfortable conversation, but was something that that shouldn't be, I should say, swept under the rug, and something that was kept quiet, which it was able to do for so much time. So hip hop was the beginning of kind of pushing that envelope. It also, though, I mean, there was that aspect, and then there's also the aspect where people would say it romanticized certain things as well, which again, as an expression, as an art form, it's going to do that as well. Like it's not, you're not going to necessarily look at the artist and say the artist is going to always see whatever's around them, if it may not be the best thing in the world, and just stick their hands in their pocket and look down as, oh yeah, like sometimes you are going to glorify, just for your own sanity, so to speak. So, but I think that social justice piece, though, it's something that you can always look from the beginning, going back, like they pointed to The Message, 1982, Grandmaster Flash, just saying how, that the music video, 1982 ended with the guys getting arrested, like for no, I didn't do it. I didn't do anything, type of thing. And, like through the present, that's been like a constant drumbeat, that hasn't been all of hip hop, but it's been something that's been present and prevalent in hip hop the whole time.
Yeah, and I think, look, if we can identify hip hop's 50 years old and began in 1973 and got its legs commercially in the 79 through the early mid 80s, think about it, 73, you're only 5 years away from the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. You still hadn't had all these, civil rights laws that we have now passed yet by the early 70s. A lot of those came during the decade of the 70s. So you still had this, people alive in the 70s obviously were alive in the 60s. So they either were participating in some of the demonstrations and the activity of the 60s, or they were kids and watching their parents or older relations do it. So I do think there is something to be said that, like when you and I were listening to hip hop, there was a much more kind of connection culturally to kind of the social justice movement, so on and so forth, than we might have today when you have a 20-year-old rapper that was born in the year 2023. After a lot of the accomplishments of that hard work from the 60s had already started to come to fruition.
2003. Yeah. 2003,
sorry. Yeah. If they were 2023, they'd be 20 days old. So, sorry. Thank you.
Well, but it's a different struggle, though, so to speak. And we've talked about
let me speak to that.
Well, let me say it real quick. Just real quick, because it's a different struggle, because this is where, like, what you're saying more so is that they just lack the context. They may lack the context of this whole time versus, just looking at it and saying everything that's happened in the last 10 years is all there is to know.
Yeah. But I just want to go back to kind of that beginning line through maybe the first 30 years, because this is where I saw some similarities with country music, actually, because to your point, as you discussed earlier about what people were seeing, and if it wasn't on the nightly news, people could turn on a rap album and hear what's going on the streets, so on and so forth. It reminded me in that way of country, because country has been seen as kind of the working class man's music, and he's telling his story about what's going on. My wife left, my dog died, I'm drinking a beer, it's like this, again, it's the pain of living in certain ways in our society. So
we got to have a show where you do the whole show in that with that.
That'd be awesome.
That accent.
I wouldn't want to offend anyone.
That twang.
But the thing is that, so here's where I saw some differences, because it's an interesting point. So, why to me hip hop so American? Because it also has the stamp on it that America refuses to address, which is our racial relations and some of that history, right? So if we look at what did hip hop sort of represent at the beginning was the demise of the working class and the middle class. Because if we look at as I thought about this with the social justice, I mean, this is galaxy brain stuff in a bit, and people might have to go do their own reading on this, but it's well documented in the 50s and 60s, a lot of Black neighborhoods in urban areas that were very affluent and wealthy were destroyed via eminent domain. We live in South Florida. There's an area in Miami called Overtown, which was seen as kind of like the Harlem of Miami. And what happens is by eminent domain, they put a highway through it. Yeah. And there's well documented that this was done on purpose back then, that just the system said, we got to put stuff somewhere, and there's a Black neighborhood, let's just put it there. So no one's ever really discussed that publicly, but hip hop came out of those ashes. And what you also had then next in the 70s was the hollowing out of the Black working class jobs in the urban areas. So areas like Rockford, Illinois, or areas where you're from in Ohio, James, became the Rust Belt first in the Black community, where they started shipping those jobs overseas. So by the 70s into the 80s, you had a lot of unemployment, homelessness, and then what did you have? A new drug called crack. And we started seeing the stereotypes of things like crack babies and all that, which has all been disproven.
Even in the 70s, though, you had heroin. You had heroin, in the 70s crack, coming around, and, cocaine, crack, and more in the 80s. But yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I say it made me realize, similar to country, is a lot of the discussions and songs that were coming out of hip hop in that era, 70s through the 90s, was about the pain and that struggle. And I look at it, how did our society treat those people? They treated them like they had a moral failing. And I kind of looked at contrast, fast forward one generation to the early 2000s to now. It's like that type of environment has hit white America, unfortunately, where we have a lot of, we've seen the hollowing out of everybody's working class and middle class jobs. And what happened in the white community in the last 20 years was the opioid crisis. But again, the country didn't attack that group and say, well, you guys just have a moral failing and all that. The country actually said, you know what, this opioid abuse seems like a healthcare crisis, and it's a crisis driven by people not having something to look forward to in their future. So again, I feel like hip hop was an early indicator of where the society was going, and it's like a canary in the coal mine. But because it was in inner cities with Black people, no one really said, hey, we should be paying attention to that. And it took 2 generations for the country to say, hey, maybe we got to do something about this, labor markets, drugs, things like that.
Well, I mean, but the art form, actually demanded attention of it to some degree.
Yeah,
now whether there was empathy for it, or whether there was an open ear, so to speak, is another story. But I just to transition from that, I did want to mention also the financial piece, because you mentioned, how hip hop has birthed billionaires. And I think one of the key distinctions there is that you're talking about not amongst the people who are already in the ownership of everything, the people who are owning the record labels or whatever, but actually amongst the participants, the artists, so to speak, were able to progressively get more and more. And I think that's something that for hip hop that has pioneered, in terms of pushing the envelope for at a different time period. They talked about how, like artists were more beholden to record labels and so forth to be able to get their information, their music out, and, you look at, it's the part of the documentary that we watched talked about the Lox and their dispute with Diddy and Bad Boy Records in terms of, like the contract they signed. They're talking about, like these are standard contracts that we signed. And so, you go back to the 90s, the standard contract was the artist giving away everything. And bucking against that was the Master P's of the world or the Jay-Z's of the world who, basically were able to set up their own mechanisms to maintaining, through their own record labels and the kinds of deals they were doing to not negotiate or to not just sign these standard contracts, which were predatory. They're contracts of adhesions. It's like, look, if you want in, you got to sign this contract that gives me everything, so to speak. And most people coming up don't have leverage to deal with that. So you kind of have to establish yourself first. And then if you go to the record company, once you've already established yourself, then you can negotiate more. And so that kind of blueprint was laid then. Fast forward to now, this is not uncommon, where people can come in to the game through, whether it be against TikTok, SoundCloud, whatever it would be, with Instagram, with a following. And so when they show up and say, okay, I want to get into music, they're not just saying, oh, please, help me, like, let's get this thing on the radio. It's like, hey, I'm coming in with X number of followers or people on TikTok. And so if you want me, here are the terms of my deal. And so it's almost, for people who can do it, it's flipped it on its head in terms of who has the leverage in this situation. And so we saw the seeds of that pre-social media in hip hop. And so I found that to be pretty interesting, just because there's still, like the way that the music industry worked, and it wasn't special to hip hop like that. That's how it worked in the 60s. That's how it worked in the 50s and in the 70s and so forth, in terms of, when you sign these record contracts, it was just, you were signing away a lot, and it was very few and far between where an artist was able to get a fair shake on the art that they were creating. So I'm happy that hip hop is associated with, that aspect of it. So final thoughts. I don't know if you want to get to mental health or, anything, but let's get.
No, I think just some final thoughts on just what you just said. I think, that just like we're saying, that hip hop is a microcosm, reflects so well the kind of just the American spirit of capitalism. I thought of a quote as you were talking, which I'll say here, is from Jay-Z's, one of his albums. And he says, I came into the game 100 grand strong, 9 to be exact, from grinding G-Packs. And that's his saying. He said, I came into rapping already with 900 grand because I was selling drugs. And, I've read a lot of things that there's just a lot of truth to that. It wasn't just boasting and making it up. So the idea is that a lot of guys were already entrepreneurial minded. I'm not trying to sit here saying advocating for selling drugs. It's a good way to be an entrepreneur. But I'm just saying the mindset of the hustle, that's something that hip hop really embraced. And like you're saying, there's certain guys, whether it's Diddy,
not just
Jay-Z,
the hustle, but the hustle with the financial component in mind, because many artists hustle.
That's what I mean by the hustle,
to make the music. Like they're grinding to make the music, and it's like, I'll just let somebody else worry about the money, and that's a bad setup, because those guys that are worried about the money are not gonna be sitting there just handing it to you. That ain't like Jay-Z on the hook.
Yeah, like Jay-Z, Dr. Dre, Diddy, these kind of the early guys, that pioneer guys that started making the real money, to me remind me of like the guys that we've done shows on from the Gilded Age, like Vanderbilt to Rockefeller and JP Morgan, meaning they went out and were like, no, I'm gonna take this, and they saw something that a lot of other people.
Those are the guys that were the most well-known and most successful, so to speak. But the forebears for that, were the Master P's and the E40s, and there were people before them that did it. They saw that example and then took it to another level.
Yeah, and just like the Gilded Age guys, like we mentioned, the industrialists, there was also a whole kind of scaffolding of professionals below them that I'm sure did very well. These guys got lawyers, accountants, and they're bringing these guys all with them. So, and then the last piece on the mental health side, I thought, again, was very interesting without realizing it. These guys were telling stories. And again, I keep bringing back, reminds me of Country or the Blues. The emotional plight and the difficulty of life when you're at the bottom of a society and the ability to tell that narrative. And that's why I say in such an American way, both country and hip hop represent very similarities there, but then are divided because of how we culturally divide ourselves via race. So again, like many things in our country, there's a lot more similarity between us, all of us as culturally, but we don't see that because of our culture of in America of race. So that to me was interesting. And that goes back to a little bit what we mentioned earlier about the drugs and the kind of scene in the 80s, where when you listen to a song like Mind Playing Tricks on Me by Ghetto Boys, like now that we're adults and we can kind of reflect with a little bit of maturity and understanding mental health and things like that, it's like, yeah, growing up in an area where you're in public housing, where there's drug use and gang violence right outside your door every day, and where the police kind of control the situation. And I mean, it's well documented now through video and technology that the police in certain inner city communities play more of an authoritarian role and not a protect and serve role. One can assume that kids growing up in that environment might have some mental health issues. So that's, to me, that was why that stood out to me a lot, that I never thought.
Well, yeah, I mean, and just poverty in general is
that,
difficult. Yeah. Poverty in general. But I mean, I think that not for nothing. I mean, it's a compelling story arc, so to speak, like starting, low and then, trying to build yourself up. I mean, that's, you look at, if you look at movies, for example, or books, like a lot of them have an arc where someone starts with a difficulty and then works to overcome that and so forth. And so that can be captivating. And so that hip hop had that to tap into readily, I'm sure was helpful in terms of the development and the popularity of the art form. So, but, like the last thing I want to talk about with this is just that we know that art reflects culture but art also changes culture, so hip hop, in itself is, something that has been, evolved out of culture that exists and then also affected the culture that it's been in. And so what's most notable to you about how hip hop has affected our culture and also, like how the larger culture has affected hip hop?
That's a good question, because as you're asking the question, I'm looking at myself in a little box with a Wu-Tang Clan t-shirt on. And as you're talking, it makes me realize, I don't know if I'd ever gotten into like subtitled karate movies when I was a teenager had it not been for these guys. Right? And so it's kind of like, it's interesting because remember, those guys were older than us. So they grew up in the 70s, early 80s. So they brought to our generation the culture of the 70s between blaxploitation films and some of those illusions, as well as things like the martial arts genre and all that. And then, of course, there's stuff being brought today. So I know that it's interesting from that standpoint culturally, but globally, I think hip hop, it's amazing how I think it went along with the global spread of technology in general, kind of like television, satellite, radio, then the internet, where hip hop became the cool thing for young people in the 1980s and the 90s while the world was globalizing and connecting from a technological standpoint. So I don't know if it's that hip hop kind of got lucky with where it was in the journey of technology, or if no matter when hip hop started, hip hop would have had such an outsized influence. But again, just like I keep bringing it back to hip hop being such a reflection of American culture, just so American, because it's just like we exported Hollywood from the 1930s and 40s, and the rest of the world became kind of Americanized from watching our movies and television shows. And it's like the last 40 years or so has been the same thing, but through hip hop culture and music. And so,
you talked about that, and you've referenced that in different times about your time living in Australia.
Yeah. So I moved to Australia in 1991 when I was a teenager. Just my mom remarried, just to explain that one. But I'm moving into a place on the other side of the world before the internet came about, and my classmates were white Aussie kids listening to NWA, Straight Outta Compton and Gangsta Gangsta and those kind of songs. And that to me was, it was, first of all, it was cool because at least I felt like I could show up and relate to these kids. At least, we had something in common. So that was cool. And then the second thing was, looking back now as an adult, is it was interesting to think about how many Australian kids really looked up and were influenced by these Black American artists. So I think that's something that I noticed, because then I've been to Japan, I've been other parts of the world, and even 25 years ago, hip hop was a big deal in these other parts of the world. So yeah, I think that's something that we don't recognize as much in America, how much influence that hip hop.
We just may not pay attention to it, because like one of the things when you watch commercials, or when you watch, movie trailers or things like that, so many of those will be set to a hip hop beat, or, different things like that. And so that subtle influence right there, that it's just like, okay, yeah, this is so a part of the culture, or the culture you want to be a part of, that if somebody's trying to sell something, they're sticking it to a hip hop beat, or a song from whatever. I think one of the key things about hip hop and its influence on the culture is how it has become and stayed really a music of the youth, and the youth are the ones oftentimes that push the culture. And so that is something that I don't think that that's luck. I mean, I think that's something about the nature of the art form, and who has been doing it historically and who does it now and so forth, but that it maintains that position of as the kind of the real prominent thing that, or a real prominent thing that youth are doing. It has kept it refreshed over time. It hasn't gotten stale, and it keeps going. Now, older people look at the younger people like, oh, y'all just mumbling now, and things like that. So, I mean, you'll always have that kind of tension anytime something becomes multi-generational. And one interesting thing they brought up in the documentary, as far as how hip hop has influenced culture, though, is that it was mentioned. I think Fat Joe might have said that Obama was the first hip hop president, in the sense that he was conversant in hip hop styles, or the ways of being, in a way that it may have familiarized himself with a lot of people. And because this is a big country, but people in this country, especially by that time, most people were familiar. People, if you were 40 and below at that time, like, you were very familiar with kind of the stylings of hip hop. And so somebody who in a speech will, knock the dirt off his shoulders is kind of, that's a signal like, oh, okay, yeah, you kind of know where it's going with that. So I think there have been many examples of how hip hop has influenced culture. Now, as far as how the culture has influenced hip hop, I think where that is with the youth, because the culture is constantly evolving. And so what the people what the youth was concerned about or doing in 1988 or 1995 is just inherently going to be different than what they're worried about in 2015 or 2023. And so there's always this, wherever the culture is going now, or is now, is hip hop has remained on the forefront of that. But it's also because the people who were doing it 20 or 30 years ago are many of them are still around. It still has a foot there as well. And so the way the culture, like, there creates almost a disconnect, but it's a disconnect in the same way, like that evolution where things can sprout up separately, and then you see later on if they merge or if they just stay under the same umbrella. But the culture influencing hip hop, what they talk about now, beyond just the normal kind of men and women, or I'm gonna beat somebody up, or I'm tougher than this guy, like that kind of man to man kind of stuff. A lot of the themes, are they've evolved, or they're more modern in a sense, in a way that doesn't always happen with art forms that kind of may get stuck in a certain time period.
Yeah, and I think based on what we've already discussed, it explains why, right? Like part of when we said 1988, I'm just thinking about, because I was alive and I was listening to hip hop already, right? I remember Public Enemy, groups like that, NWA. So it was still about this kind of coming out of this struggle, and Black people not feeling like they were still accepted as 100% participants in the system. And I think now is interesting because of the wealth that we discussed that has kind of also followed hip hop, and it's become its own economy in a sense, or a microeconomy within a larger economy. We don't see a lot of artists coming from the same area of I'm here to talk about this social justice struggle. Now, that's different from people saying that, I'm coming from the inner city or something like that. But this idea that collectively we as a culture, as Black Americans, have this struggle in that way is definitely not the same as it was back then. And rightfully so, because, my joke, I say integration worked. So at some point, after a generation or two of the initial struggle, it will be different. And I think you're right. I thought about that too in preparing today and reading all this stuff about how hip hop was always like a teenager's movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking like, yeah, I'm not a teenager. No, so I'm just an old fart now, just complaining about all the youngsters. It's inevitable. So you just got to be honest about it.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I think Nas came out with a new album like last year and he's 50 now. And I was all looking forward to it because I'm like, yeah, it's going to be the type of hip hop I like. He's going to do it. So, like, I can't listen to this stuff on the radio. So I feel like someone in my mom's generation who maybe listened to the Eagles or the Beatles or something back in the 60s or 70s. And they're like in the like early 2000s, they're like, man, or 90s, man, what's this Nirvana stuff, man? And this Pearl Jam, what's this crap? This isn't the same stuff I grew up with. So it's all,
I mean, but the thing about hip hop is that it's still, there is room for all of that, and so, and then it'll continue to evolve, but I think you raised a good point as far as now, you go back to 1988, it's not everybody that are rapping about, that spend a lot of their time or that their kind of image is to rap about the struggle. I mean, you still had, the LL Cool J's of the world or different things like that. We're just, like there was, it was, by then it was diverse as well. So we shouldn't frame it as it was all one thing. But I do think, though, that there are new struggles now, though, that certain artists and because we're not in in that demo of the youth that are pushing the envelope now, we may not see it. But, like we just had this whole, Black Lives Matter and, George Floyd and Ferguson, Missouri and, protests a few years ago, so it's not like the social justice struggle has just, oh, it's all good now. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, we're just, skipping along the road, everybody, like that stuff is still there. And that stuff is still reflected in hip hop, but what I do think is that commercially, it seemed like a lot of like the NWAs and the Public Enemies of the world were much more prominent. If you go back then, and maybe there could be a lot of different reasons for that. I don't know why that is, but they were a lot more prominent. Whereas now, maybe one of the reasons is, again, it's homogenized, like there is a general sound of hip hop because everything's been kind of blended together and you don't have, as much people isolated and creating on their own without any influence from this part of the country or that part of the country or this style or that style. What's commercial is less of that. What's commercial is the commercial stuff has become more cookie cutter over time, as opposed to things that may just catch on because they're either pushed, by a record label. I'm not trying to present some kind of romanticized version of what happened in 1992, or it might have just caught on the radio, but and then algorithms, like algorithms are also determine what we see, what we watch, or what we see, what we hear, what we like, because it may be done all over and over and over again. And influencers, like tastemakers, so to speak, which are more dispersed now. It's not just somebody sitting in a record label room deciding what are we going to hit the public with? It's not just that. Like it's more democratic in a sense, but also it's less democratic in the sense that we got machines, these algorithms making decisions for us as far as what we're going to see. So all of that stuff plays a role. But, I don't think we can say that it's less conscious now. I can say that the conscious stuff is probably less prominent.
Yeah. No, it's, I agree with you. I think, but that's where, to me, it's all that kind of train from the 60s and that influence on the culture to now, right? Because and you make a good point, and I'm glad you said that, because I don't want to make it appear to someone that's not immersed in the culture like we've been, that somehow hip hop in the 70s through the 90s was all about, this kind of like the struggle and all these things that were all kind of like, very serious, but also maybe, discussed in rap songs. Rap was always a big part of it was about having a good time, partying, having fun, the whole breakdance movement. And it was actually started. I mean, I think it's important for us to note this, that hip hop was started as a positive way for young people to get their energy out. Yeah. Breakdancing in New York replaced gang fights. And that was the community itself made all that happen. So instead of, two rival gangs having 20 guys going to bludgeon each other to death in the back of an alley, they would decide, hey, let's have a break dance battle. Kind of like a duel back in the day, let's instead, but not kill each other. Let's just see who's got the better dances. And unfortunately, some of those, later on did turn into gangs that decided that they didn't want to, again, like we say, war is politics by another means. They no longer wanted to break dance it off, and they just started getting violent again. I mean, that's kind of the regular human part of certain things. But this idea that it was the conscious rap was also, and by conscious, I mean, people that were really putting an effort to be very thoughtful in their rhymes about what they saw in their society and the culture, as opposed to, let's say, gangster rap, which did maybe reflect what was going on out in the street, but did it in a much more vulgar way.
And was purposefully more full of embellishment. It's art. It's art. Like if you want a news reporter to tell you exactly what happened, that's different than going to a artist for them to tell you. An artist is going to try to get a reaction out of you. You're trying to get emotion out of you, and not necessarily try to give you the play by play exactly. And so, actually, our second topic we're going to discuss it goes along these lines. We might as well
jump into it.
Basically, over the past few weeks, we've seen it come out that prosecutors, and this deals with, moving past just the 50th anniversary of hip hop, we're going to talk about a hip hop story. And prosecutors, there's a rapper, Young Thug, and he's being prosecuted right now. And the prosecutors want to use his lyrics in his songs as part of their case, to try to convict the guy. And we saw Fat Joe, who is a rapper, been out there for 30 years, and he came out and was saying this is crazy. And his money quote, was that 95% of what I've said in my raps is not truthful. So or 95% of my rap, my songs, contain stuff that's not truthful. So it that catches the headline. But so what do you think about both the effort, that prosecutors are having, this isn't the first time, this is something that was actually, this was talked about a lot in the 90s, like whether, with different artists, Tupac, whatever, this came up before, but this effort by prosecutors to use lyrics against him. And then Fat Joe coming back and, kind of trying to lay the gauntlet down and saying, hey, you're trying to show how ridiculous this might be.
Yeah, I mean, I find that as potentially another reflection of our American culture. Because to your point, I mean, I'm not going to say hip hop's the only art form or kind of modern, just cultural thing that's been targeted this way by the justice system at times, because there could be others that I'm just ignorant to. But to your point, I remember when we were kids, I'm talking about like 25, 30 years ago, probably more like 30, because Tupac was killed in 1996. So I remember when he was younger in his rap career in the early 90s, some guy had shot a police officer this guy had nothing to do with Tupac. But he claimed in court as a way to defend himself, I don't think it worked, but that he had been listening to Tupac songs while he was driving. And that's why when the cop pulled him over, he had lost his mind and killed this cop. So the idea of using rap lyrics in trying to either get out of something or accuse somebody of something in the justice system isn't new. And the reason why I said it again, reminds me as a reflection of kind of just the way American culture has been, as much as some people don't want to address this, is because I look at it that, we don't assume that when Arnold Schwarzenegger, you and I were growing up and watching his movies like Commando or whatever, the Terminator, that as a human being, he really behaved like that. He just walked around into buildings and started shooting people. We knew that he was an actor, right?
Yeah. Marlon Brando, The Godfather, there's, that.
Or even let's bring it to music, like the heavy metal and death metal of the 80s and 90s, where people were talking about, drinking blood and Ozzy Osbourne bit ahead of a bat off at one of his concerts. I mean, these guys behaved in a very, vulgar way themselves. But people didn't take those lyrics and say, well, I think he was drinking blood. Let's go take him to court and see let's get him on the case.
That's not 100% true. Those guys could be ignorant for that stuff too.
No, but what I'm saying is actually like using it in a court case. Now, my point is just saying that it seems that this case is where, and this is why I don't want to be too stereotypy, especially not being in the case, but from the outside, I'll discuss it, right? It looks like here's a young black kid in his 20s that's being accused of something. And in order to make the case work, now they're going to start using everything, including his lyrics, and not allow him that deference of freedom of speech because he's an artist to say, no, I don't actually live like this every day. I'm performing as an artist. Just like if I painted a canvas of a guy stabbing another guy, doesn't mean I did that myself. I'm just an artist painting a canvas. So I think that's what I mean by this American thing, that it's just the demographic of who this guy is. It makes it interesting. I've never heard of a court case taking someone who's known to be an artist and then taking their art and saying, well, we're going to apply this and assume that's how you are with the rest of your whole life. Because that means every actor in every action movie got to go to jail.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things going on there. You know, like prosecutors, because Fat Joe was saying even like prosecutors know that this is ridiculous. And, you know, like, so one of the things that's going on is that the prosecutors are purposefully trying to play on what they believe the biases of the jury will be. You know, like so they're like, oh, okay, yeah, whether or not we actually think this, we're trying to win. You know, that's kind of that zero sum game, which is not good. I'm not saying that's a good thing. But I think there is a piece about this that makes it a little bit more in depth of a story, in that part of hip hop, and I mentioned this to you offline, but like part of hip hop is about, well, not all hip hop, but certain aspects of hip hop, when we saw the gangster rap and stuff like that, or just other different types of the art, is about selling authenticity in yourself. You know, it's about that. Oh yeah, I really am like this. You know, like, and so therefore I'm dangerous, and so therefore that makes me more marketable and so forth. That doesn't have to be true, but you are trying to sell the public on a persona, which for in distinguish Arnold Schwarzenegger or Marlon Brando, they don't have to sell. Marlon Brando doesn't have to sell the public that he actually is a Don in order for people to go watch, or for more people to go watch the Godfather, you know? And so there's, but because,
you
so
mean that wasn't true?
Say what?
I said, you mean that wasn't true? You just ruined my whole thing.
So I'm saying this without judgment though. Like, to me, it's interesting in the sense that, like, I remember hearing stories, or watch things talking about how in professional wrestling, like the heels and the baby faces, the guys who sold themselves as part of the wrestling show as bad guys, were not able to. Those are the heels, and then the baby faces are the guys that sold themselves as the good guys. Those guys were not able to, after the show, go out and have a beer, together. Like, they couldn't go to the same spot and have a beer together because then people would get upset about the wrestling show. So maybe this is all about the gullibility of the public in general. The prosecutors right here are playing on a gullible public. Like, yeah, we know this guy's an artist, but you dopes don't. You guys think that if he says this stuff on a record, then you can be persuaded that he really does this kind of stuff. In the same way that people who did professional wrestling were like, oh yeah, I can't go out. Hulk Hogan can't go out if he's beefing with Randy Savage. He can't go out with Randy Savage at the same time, even though they're friends in real life, because then the public's going to get mad. And so, I mean, maybe that
would have messed that would have messed my 10-year-old brain up if I saw them hanging out after. I'm telling you, man, I used to believe all that.
But that's my point, though, is because authenticity, so to speak, is, and once you look at pro wrestling, and then once you look at hip hop, and you understand that they're selling a product in addition to making an art form, then you can understand that authenticity kind of thing. But yeah, there should be no expectation that everything you say in a rap is true. But there may be, I mean, at least based on, like the way people would behave, there may be some benefit in making people think that the stuff you say is true. Like, you just earlier today, you were talking about how Jay-Z and his, he came in the game with $900,000. Like, oh yeah, well, maybe he was rich. And we don't know that, but he said it, so, but he benefits though, if we think that that's true.
Yeah, no, he does. And that's where I think it's an interesting contrast also, where it's rare that I've seen it that in our society, and I agree with you, and I appreciate you saying that. Obviously, the prosecution's trying to win, so they're going to use. Well,
but don't get me wrong. I don't want to save this for the end. I think it's wrong that the prosecution is doing this. Like, I think criminal justice is not a football game. Like, it's not just I want to win. It's like, nah, man. You're supposed to be an officer of the court. You're supposed to not try to trick play on the jury's bias to win a case. Do better. Kind of thing is my.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if the prosecution does prevail using this tactic. If it were to maybe cause a little bit of muting of other artists talking certain ways, because maybe people would say, "Hey, look, I don't want to be. I can't predict if I'm going to be in some situation that's gets me into a courtroom. I don't want to say certain things." So it's again, that's why I say it's an interesting discussion, which we won't have now, but about freedom of speech and the state. Maybe potentially having a chilling effect on the ability of artists to feel free to express, like you said, even if it's BS, like worldwide, WWE, the wrestling, it's still entertainment. Yeah. And so that's a whole separate interesting conversation. I didn't even think.
I mean, and you're come up. Not for nothing. You're right about if somebody painted something, it wouldn't be. But if somebody went and stole it, I'm sure Bernie Madoff wouldn't be out there painting pictures of him stealing money from people. You know what I'm saying? Like, that would be a bad idea. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
I wonder if it would be like his finger, just like this in someone's pocket, or if he'd be like typing on like he's stealing it electronically. That'd be interesting.
But there's just this kind of, thing at play going on with, almost like performance art, so to speak. And how, it seems like we, the public, are the dupes here, because of course an artist should be free to express themselves and, not have that come back on them. Like, if you're gonna do other stuff, then prove they did the other stuff. Don't point at the art.
I'm laughing because the whole time you're talking about wrestling, all I thought about is our politics today. I was
well, that's baby facing heels too.
I'm sure Trump and Biden probably going out to have a beer tonight in DC. Like you're saying, they couldn't let us see that, but they're probably laughing like, "Hey, man, look at these."
Well, but see, the interesting thing about that, we got to wrap up. But the interesting thing about that is that actually was closer to the truth in the 90s and the early 2000s, and then there was, I think. What happened was, and literally, the people would fight hard, and but then they would play softball games together or have beers together, and but what evolved, particularly as cable news became more prominent, as social media became more prominent, is that the people who were kind of in on it, and that hey, we behave a certain way, but we're all part of the same fraternity. Those people started leaving. And the people that started replacing them thought it was real. So it's like in wrestling, the people are like, no, I thought you were really trying to hurt these guys. You know what I'm
saying? So then it's like the analogy is so then one day maybe that's what January 6th was an idiot time to the top of the ropes, literally jumping on his head and
really trying to really hurt the guy. Exactly. I thought we've been doing this the whole time. Like, nah, man, that was for show. So yeah, but we can get out of here on that one. But we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode.
Hold on. We started a show on hip hop and ended on Jimmy the Superfly Snuka doing a super pile driver from the edge of the ring. Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know how we did
man. Superfly. Yeah, there you go. So, off the top ropes, man. That's how we got to
bring that one out for you.
All right. So, we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review us, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Check us out on YouTube. Till next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk to you next time.